here's the resource I wanted to share with you, and the actual full research you'll see in the resources that Kapana shares. But I think this visual really sort of speaks to how students, before they even come to us at 4 years old, you'll see the middle part, have expressions of racial prejudice. And it actually peaks at age 4 and 5. How this was explained to me many years ago, having my own kids, I've got a 11-year-old and a 16-year-old and 18-year-old, and I've observed this with my own eyes. As long as kids, babies, are able to tell the difference between hues, as long as they're able to observe behavior and mimic behavior, and then as long as they're able to follow pattern, all those things they're able to do very early on in their life, they can observe and repeat racism. That's all it takes. And if you read more about the various research that you'll see on this slide, you'll understand that racism happens in human beings much earlier than many of us think as teachers. So we have to be prepared to have those conversations with our learners.
I guess we're talking about anti-racist babies today. I received a teacher resource this week that left me aghast. I quite literally gasped alone in my room when I read it the first time. And I think we need to have a conversation about how teachers might be discussing sensitive topics with very, very young children. And we need to have this discussion publicly, openly, and with transparency. So I'm going to go through this resource with you. The easiest thing to do is to just read through it and have a look. This is a resource from the HWDSB, the Halton Wentworth District School Board here in Ontario, and is designed as a module to understand identity and intersectionality. To understand this resource, I think we need to start from the end and work our way to the front of it. There is a section called Educator Pre-Reflection, which indicates to me that this is what they want the teacher to deliver or to think about before they deliver the lesson. So let's have a look at what it says under Educator Pre-Reflection. Before engaging in this lesson, consider or think about. Racial colorblindness is an approach to reduce interracial tension, which proposes that racial categories do not matter and should not be considered when making decisions, such as hiring and school admissions. The primary tenet of this approach is that social categories should be dismantled and disregarded, and everyone should be treated as an individual. This is rational. This is a rational approach to treat people equally. But it says this ideology posits itself on the premise of equality for all, correct, rather than equity, and thus, at its core, is an insidious practice of racism in and of itself. So it's very clear that they're not interested in equality for all, and that equality for all is not equity. Our education system is based on equity, which is not equality for all. It does not like racial blindness. It wants you to focus on race. It says, the core premise of this lesson is to negate such colorblind practice by attempting to bring race into the conversation in primary classrooms. This is extremely necessary and important way of disrupting the development of racist beliefs and thoughts in the early years as children start internalizing racial bias by the time they're 5 years old. Now think back to the introduction video, babies are racist. Furthermore, please be aware that race is a heavy burden that many racialized students carry, even at the very early age due to their lived experiences. If a racialized student is unwilling to share, participate, or even be present for this conversation, it may be due to personal triggers. So this could upset kids. They know that the way that they're going to frame this, the way they're going to approach it, could really upset very young children. But it's important to do it. Thus, enforcing them in a conversation about race they do not feel safe could cause them harm, basically. As the expert of your student's background, history, triggers, body language, and classroom dynamics, please make informed and empathetic decisions regarding ensuring a safe and inclusive setting to engage in these brave conversations. I'm going to go and suggest that perhaps the empathetic and responsible thing to do is not do this, but we're going to do it anyway. So I'm going to take you to the first page where they talk about the key vocabulary that they're going to introduce on this lesson. So here the idea that the human species is divided into distinct groups based on their inherited physical and behavioral differences. Racial categorization schemes were invented by scientists to support worldviews that viewed some groups of people as superior and some as inferior. So this is the key vocabulary for kindergarten to grade 1. We're going to tell them that there were some scientists that decided that some people were superior and some people were inferior based on their race. We're going to tell that to kindergarten to grade 1. That could upset them, but we're going to do this. Genetic studies have concluded that race is a made-up social construct to uphold European and white standards. We're going to tell this to kindergartners, and not an actual biological fact. Okay. And under racial identity, it says an individual's awareness and experience of being a member of a racial and ethnic group, the racial and ethnic categories that an individual chooses to describe him or herself based on such factors as biological heritage, physical appearance, cultural affiliation, early socialization, and personal experience. That is a lot to be sharing or to be going into with kindergarten to grade 1. What are they, like 5 and 6 years old? It's sort of framed, like I said, because they don't want you to ignore race. We don't want to make everyone feel like we're all individuals and deserve our own merit. No, we need to focus on race. Interestingly, the curriculum connections that they mention are for kindergarten are self-regulation and well-being. So this is about, already we know we're going to upset, or we're very likely to upset some students, that we're going to be talking about how some people said that some people were superior and others weren't, that there's something that upholds a European white standard, so white supremacy. It's this thing that exists that we have to tell kindergartners about, behind the backs of their parents, by the way. I doubt they ask parents permission to do this, but I don't know that for a fact. And we're going to do this to help them self-regulate and to help their well-being. We're going to upset them, but that's going to help them self-regulate and their well-being. So I did a video from a guy covering somebody called Kumashiro, who did anti-oppressive theory of education. And he very much talked about this very kind of thing, where you would deliberately cause cognitive dissonance or discomfort within the minds of young people. You knew that you were going to cause that discomfort. And it was designed through, I imagine, the self-regulation and well-being aspect to then guide them in direction that you want them to go on that topic.
Thank you. 4 parts, right? But actually, let me see. Well, I'll quickly tell you a story. Okay, so one of my favorite movies is The Matrix. Can you believe that's like over 20 years ago, 1999? So The Matrix is set several decades in the future. Machines have taken over the world. Machines need power to operate though. So what's the battery source? What's the fuel source for machines? It's actually the human bodies. You remember the scene, those of you who saw this movie, where there's millions of pods and all these bodies are like lying down in these pods and they're fueling, they're battery sources for these machines. So main character of this movie is Neo. And Neo at the beginning of the first Matrix is given the blue pill, red pill choice, right? You take the blue pill, you go back to sleep, and you continue thinking that the real world, or I forgot one part that I have to say. So how do they get us to be batteries? They hook our brains up to a computer simulation program that makes us think we're living several decades in the past, in the 1990s. Okay? So if you take the blue pill, you go back into this virtual reality, right? You continue to think that the real world is the 1990s. But if you take the red pill, you'll wake up and you'll see what's actually happening. And there was a Matrix and 2 sequels. So clearly the main character took the red pill so that he would wake up and lead the humans in this battle against machines, right? So what does he learn? Well, he learns that the real world is far more harsh than what he thought, right? It's several decades in the future. The climate has been destroyed. Humans are living underground. Those who have escaped the pods are living in hiding underground. They're being hunted by machines, so it's dangerous. It's cold, it's scary. They eat what looks like slop for food. I mean, it's just a very harsh existence, right? There's one point in this movie early on where the main character is so upset at what he's learning that he stumbles backwards, falls to the ground, and throws up. And I saw that scene and I thought, that scene captures this theory of learning through crisis. So let me talk about the 4 parts of this theory. Part number 1 is learning involves unlearning. Learning involves unlearning. By unlearning, I mean questioning what you thought was the case. So common sense tells us that learning is when you accept some new information. It's like Freire's banking education, right? It's like depositing knowledge in a bank account. But what we know is that actually that rarely happens. When students come to our classrooms, it's rarely the case that there's nothing in the head. Scientists call this sense. We develop a sense of the world just by living in it, right? So we have all these ideas already when we come to schools about almost any topic that you can think about. So the job of education isn't simply to give more information. The job of education is actually to get us to question what we thought in order to learn something new. It's like if you watch my hands, we often think this is addition, this. So why wouldn't a young kid think that 2 + 2 is 22? And sometimes that is what they'll answer. You have to get them to unlearn that in order to learn that 2 + 2 is 4. Or again, if you watch my hands, we look across the horizon, we see it look like this, right? It looks like this. So why wouldn't we think that the world is flat? I actually have to unlearn that in order to learn that the world is round. Okay. Second point is that unlearning can make us uncomfortable. Unlearning can lead to discomfort. So I'm not that uncomfortable if you, wait, what am I trying to say? I like learning that I was right. I like picking up a book and thinking to myself, I always thought that was the case. And look, Dr. Vajra Watson says that right here. I don't like picking up a book and learning I was wrong the whole time. And what's important with this theory is that the more invested I am in what I learned, the more uncomfortable I might be when I have to question it. So I'm not that uncomfortable if you tell me that 2 + 2 is not 22. But what if I thought I got to where I am because I'm smarter and I worked harder than everyone else, and now you're trying to teach me about concepts like privilege, entitlement, and advantage? Well, that might make me really uncomfortable, right? And that then leads to point number 3, that discomfort can make us resist. Discomfort can lead to resistance. If you're telling me something and it's making me uncomfortable, I don't usually think to myself, wow, that's making me uncomfortable. Like, tell me more and make me more uncomfortable. Like, that's not usually my response. My response is usually, wow, this is making me uncomfortable. Maybe I should stop listening. And these walls of resistance come up all the time, right? And in fact, that's why many educators, especially curriculum theorists, argue that a central challenge with education isn't a lack of knowledge. Remember diversity trainings over the past few decades. What is a commonsensical way that we talk about diversity trainings? It's that people don't know enough about racism, so my job is to teach them more about racism. Well, actually, this theory tells us that that's not really the only problem. The problem isn't only that we lack knowledge. The problem is also that we resist knowledge, or we resist hearing how you're trying to talk about racism, right? And why is this so important? Because does everyone see then that according to this theory, the more I try to so-called teach, the more I try to get you to think the way I want you to think, the more you might actually resist learning. This is what we might call one of the central contradictions of teaching, right? The more I teach, the more you might actually resist learning. So that then leads to the 4th part of this theory, that education, therefore, must address resistance. Education, therefore, must address resistance. So what does it mean to acknowledge that when we're trying to get people to see things differently, that they might become uncomfortable and resistant? How do we then structure learning through that process? And the reason I bring this up in a leadership presentation is because I want to argue, as many have before me, that leading is fundamentally a pedagogical act. Leading isn't about conformity. Leading is actually about getting people to see that we can do things differently, that we can be different, right? And does everyone also see that there are many ways that scholars use the term resistance? Scholars, activists, educators use the term resistance differently, right? In justice education, we often want resistance to the status quo. We want people to resist oppression. We want people to resist kind of power structures, right? I would call this a political resistance. But the kind of resistance that I just talked about in this theory is actually not that. The kind of resistance I'm talking about is actually a psychic resistance. It's a psychic resistance. It's resisting sort of changing how I currently think. So that's important as well, right? Is that let's differentiate between the different kinds of resistances that are out there. Now, many disciplines actually talk about the role of discomfort and resistance in change. Some of you are psychologists, so there's lots of psychological theories that talk about change and talk about how thinking about something differently or feeling about something differently might make us uncomfortable and resistant. Those of you who study organizational development and org theory, you'll also know that there's all kinds of phases that we expect organizations to go through when you're trying to implement change, and they involve discomfort and resistance. There's also social movement theory that talks about transforming societies. And what do they focus on? The role of discomfort and resistance when learning new ideas and seeing that things could be different, right? So whether we're talking about individuals, whether we're talking about institutions, whether we're talking about society, we need to be grappling with the role of resistance. For this lens then, I'm going to offer this reflection question. What are different forms of discomfort and resistance that we might expect when leading towards justice, and what are ways to address these? Sometimes I do these multiple day leadership workshops, and this is one of the questions that I ask people to help me think through. I just presented you a theory of learning through crisis or teaching through crisis. What does it mean to lead in a way that we forefront the expectation of resistance? Right? All right, so then let's talk about my fourth lens, which is a little bit more of a brief comment, and then we'll open up for maybe a couple of questions. My fourth lens is using social movements as a frame. So here, what I want to argue is that, I've become more and more obsessed with the idea that we need to look at other models. We need to look at other spaces that can provide models for leadership and education, right? As many of you know, way too much over the past century and increasingly over the past century, what is the model that we have relied on to shape educational institutions and the work of educators? Well, it's the corporate model. It's neoliberal ideology. And this filters so much of what we think about: human resources, assessment, budgeting, all of that, right? So what I would suggest is that we actually should be looking at social movements. As many have argued, social movements really can be what we point to as what changes societies. Laws help to change societies. Leaders, they help to change societies as well. But what really changes societies are social movements, right? So social movements, I want to talk about some of the elements of social movements, but let me just sort of contrast. A social movement is not an organization. It's not an initiative. And it's not the dictates of a leader. So what then is it? Actually, as I post my elements, I also want to point out that when we talk about something like the civil rights movement, many people think of the major victories of the civil rights movement in terms of its legislation and court victories, right? Civil Rights Act, Brown versus Board of Education, Voting Rights Act, and so on, right? But many of you are aware that in the midst of the civil rights movement, there were leaders and scholars who were arguing that these victories were actually compromises. They were steps forward and steps back, often pragmatically so, often intentionally so, but they were nonetheless partial victories. So it's not the case that the civil rights movement is to be understood primarily or only even in terms of its legislative victories. That actually what makes a movement powerful is that it changes how we as a nation think about things. The civil rights movement was powerful because it changed how we think and talked about things like race and rights, or diversity and democracy. Same with the Occupy movement. Did it have any major legislative changes in its immediacy? No. What made it a movement was that it rattled how the nation, how the populace was talking about certain ideas like elitism and the masses, right? So when I think about social movements, let me point to four aspects that I think can inform education as well. First, is that social movements are ground up. Like I said, they're not a leader or an organization sort of leading the charge. Social movements actually bubble up, which is why they're often very fractured, right? So think of the civil rights movement. You had different groups that were in some ways in strong opposition to each other strategically, right? In terms of what they were supposed to be acting on. And yet they were unified around a larger vision and a larger critique, right? So just as a social movement is ground up, it's of the people, so too are they working collectively. They're not necessarily unified, right? But they are collective. They're coming together to kind of work in solidarity with one another. A social movement also focuses on reframing. So it's not just about changing policies, it's about changing how we think, right? Some of you are in the field of educational policy studies. Well, what do we know is one of the central questions in educational policy studies? It's why do we create policies that often look nothing like their implementation? And what is the answer? Well, the answer is because those who are trying to implement don't often have the same shift in thinking of those who wrote the policy, right? What you actually need to do is try to change how we're thinking about things. You need to rattle what has become conventional wisdom, what often goes unquestioned in our spaces. Right? And then finally, social movements also have sort of this attention to strategic levers. In other words, what can you tackle that will have a rippling effect or that will have subsequent victories to follow, right? So what I would urge us to think about is, as we look at our work as leaders, how can these elements of social movements inform our work as leaders? And I've talked about sort of how leaders should be getting us to question conventional wisdom, right? And that's what's going to make us uncomfortable, make people resist. So that's where reframing comes in, right? That leadership is fundamentally about reframing, I would argue. But leadership, I want to focus on the second point as my final comment, which is that leadership is also fundamentally about moving collectively. Like, one of the things that I'm trying to get in my work with institutions is to get us to think about what does it mean for an institution to be led collectively, right? The more that a leader thinks that they are responsible for inaugurating all these changes, I think the more you set yourself up for failure. What you actually need to be doing is getting your school or your institution to think that they all have a responsibility to lead. When I posted that framework for institutional transformation in my, lens number 2, and I said I was going to come back to it. So here's where I'm coming back to it. What you'll see in that framework is the argument that the way you transform an institution is you lead them through these kinds of conversations that rattle conventional wisdom, that's trying to reframe our work. And that can only happen when that work is done collectively, when everyone is a part of that kind of critical inquiry, right? So part of what I'm saying is that education needs to make a political intervention. It needs to be relevant to the problems of the world. But part of what I'm also saying is that the way we do that is we rethink not just what education work is, but what leadership is. And that one of the most powerful, I think, models for that reframing can be social movements. So these then are some of the lenses and questions that I offer as food for thought in engaging in this important work. I hope that this presentation is helpful for all of the work that lies ahead for all of you. And I look forward to seeing the kinds of changes that you make possible when you embark in this labor. Thanks so much for having me. Why don't I turn the microphone back to Vajra?
Right? So you want to create a resistance, according to Kevin Kumashiro. The resistance, you don't want the children to resist you as the teacher when you cause this cognitive dissonance. You want that resistance to be aimed at the system man. So it's designing to change the way that they view the world. The way that I interpret Kevin Kumashiro personally is a soft way of brainwashing, but that's just my interpretation. Please go read Kevin Kumashiro and see if you interpret that in any different way. So we'll just have a quick look at self-regulation and well-being. So now that we know that they're going to be talking about white supremacy and there's these colonial expectations and these evil scientists that decided some people were better than others and it's going to cause all this discomfort, we're doing this to help them manage their thinking and feelings and their recognition and respect for differences in the thinking and feelings of others, which sounds really great on the surface, but they're doing it from this anti-racist position where you have to see race. Remember, we just talked about that. You have to enhance race consciousness. We don't want race colorblindness. So we're going to enhance their thinking and feelings on how to view the world racially. They're going to regulate their emotions. If they get upset that some scientists thought that they were better than others, we're going to regulate those emotions and adapt the distractions and assess consequences of those actions in a way that enables them to engage in learning. Learning about anti-racism, learning that some people, that white supremacy is this systemic thing that oversees everything, and some people, the whiteness it has to be disrupted and dismantled. Like all of those things are sort of like starting to be introduced very early on in kindergarten to grade 1. That their physical and mental, they want to enhance physical and mental health well-being. In connections with this frame, it's important for educators to consider interrelatedness of children's self-awareness. So you must be aware of your race, that race consciousness and the race of other people, the sense of self and ability to self-regulate on those topics. So if you get upset, we're going to help direct you in the proper direction on how to view people racially, right? And somehow this is supposed to enhance inclusion. It's supposed to enhance people's ability to accept one another. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but this kind of framing, this way of understanding the anti-racist theory, the Kevin Kumashiro approaches, have a very, very negative impact based on proper scientific analysis. But we'll talk about that in a bit. The reason I gasped, oh, and by the way, I won't go through all the details. I'll put it up on the screen, but they do this, or they introduce this idea, this concept through drawing an image of yourself and talking about different aspects of your identity. So the lesson uses drawing a picture of yourself and then uses the drawing a picture of yourself to then explore themes of identity through the lens of racial consciousness. This is why I gasped. I didn't know how to communicate this with you other than just going through the material, but I felt like this was an incredibly manipulative approach to a very destructive ideology and doing it at the very beginning of education. So at the very earliest years in kindergarten, teaching children to reject colorblindness, to focus on race, and somehow that's supposed to help them. Oh, and introduce them to the idea that white supremacy is a thing. Do you think that a kindergartner or a grade 1 or even grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5 are able to understand the nuance that these educators feel that they're introducing? Probably not. Their young people are very black and very white. They have an immature brain. If you tell them that there's evil, they're going to interpret there's evil scientists that decided that white people were better than everyone else, and if you're not white, then you are somehow inferior, and that we need to hyper-focus on race, and perhaps you have children who are white-skinned or light-skinned, feeling bad about themselves. There's all these things that you can introduce, and I know that they want to go through this self-regulation and well-being and help them cope with these feelings, but they're not parents. These people are teachers. They're not trained with mental health. They're not trained in counseling and in psychological interventions. And yet that's what this feels like it's doing. It's training them to view the world through a racial lens. So you have to view race. You have to focus on it, because if I take you back to what we were discussing in the beginning, is that to them, racial colorblindness is a form of insidious racism. So we're training them because we believe that babies are racist. So we need to train them to view race so we can, as the paper says at the top, learn, disrupt, and rebuild. I assume that they're not actually asking for consent before doing a lesson like this. And if they're not, why not? Why does this have to be leaked to me for me to share with the public? Why are they not just telling parents that this is what they're doing? Anyway, that's a whole other conversation that I don't really have answers to. But these are the kind of things that pop into my mind when I see resources like this, which is why I gasped at the level of manipulation that is occurring with, frankly, defenseless 6-year-olds. At the very top, like I said, Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild, I wanted to see what this is. So this seems to be a program that is delivered at the HWDSB. So let's have a look at this program. Okay, this is where it takes me. So there's a whole section on here. If they Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild at HWDSB, we are aware of how COVID-19 has highlighted 2 pandemics in our society, one related to the virus itself and one related to social inequities. The virus intensified anti-Black racism. HWDSB is committed to developing safer, more equitable, and more inclusive learning environments. Schools have an important role in learning about equity. Again, not equality for all, because that's insidious racism, equity, and supporting student and staff well-being. To address both pandemics, a team of staff informed our community our community created a series of lessons called this Learn, Disrupt, Rebuild. Okay, and I thought, well, is this lesson that I was just handed on their publicly available lessons? So maybe I was wrong. Maybe they always shared them publicly. It says that these lessons from kindergarten to grade 12 students align with their board annual plan, equity action plan, and these lessons will support students and staff on topics related to human rights, equity, mental health during the pandemic. Let's go have a look. So primary modules. The TLDR here is that no, the lesson that I'm sharing with you, which is clearly part of this suite of learning for kindergarten to grade 12, is not actually publicly available if you look at these public lessons that they have. But I did find it interesting. You can go look at these yourself, but I found this one interesting, Understanding Black Lives Matter. This is what they have out for the public. Black Lives Matter has been under all kinds of fire for embezzling money, pushing Ibram X. Kendi type radical anti-racist theory. And here, this is for primary school, to develop an introductory understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement, which right now in the USA is thoroughly discredited as not being great. I think in the capital, the America's capital, there's a road with the Black Lives Matter painted on it that they're removing. So America's giving up on this because they realized that it's not been great. But here, it's a primary resource. And we saw the resource that I just read, and this one's the public one, really celebrating Black Lives Matter. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of it. But again, this is the race consciousness. It's focusing on race, making sure that children don't develop race colorblindness. We want race consciousness. So yeah, you can go look at this resource. So I mentioned Ibram X. Kendi. I have come across references to Ibram X. Kendi in HWDSB resources I've looked at, and I just want to share a couple of quotes. So in How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is often referred to, Ibram X. Kendi says, when I see racial disparities, I see racism. So what does that mean? That means that any differences between groups is always down to some kind of racism within the system. Our education system has adopted this. They have disparity. They collect racial data or identity-based data. And any differences between different groups, to them, always has to be some kind of systemic injustice. They don't look at any other reasons. This is very Ibram X. Kendi orientated. There's another quote from his book where it says, the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. So when they say they want to create inclusion, what they're actually doing, the equity, we don't want equality for all because that is insidious racism. They're anti-racist, right? And the anti-racist views it as there needs to be present discrimination towards the so-called white supremacist ideology or white supremacist society. There needs to be discrimination against majority groups to remedy past discrimination. That's where this is coming from. That's the equity. That's centering the marginal voices. I just want to be clear. I think we should help young children not to bully and not to discriminate in this way and help them. But I don't think this is the method to do it. I think specifically the anti-racist ideology that the schools have adopted or decided to take on board and deliver to young people is actually going to be, is going to cause a lot more harm than good in the long run. Why do I think this? So I mentioned Ibram X. Kendi, and I gave you a few quotes about the ideology that is reflected within our education system. But there was a study by the Network Contagion Research Institute and the Rutgers University Social Perception Lab. They found something pretty wild. Just reading anti-racist theory, but specifically in this case, Ibram X. Kendi texts and Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility in a very similar way, actually increases racial bigotry. It doesn't decrease it, doesn't create inclusion, it doesn't create equity, it creates racial bigotry. So this does sound counterintuitive, but let me take you through the text. People read excerpts from Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, but they also read a control text, which is just about corn agriculture. So just a basic text about agriculture. And they were then given scenarios of a university admissions officer, which had no racial bias in it whatsoever. They were designed to be perfectly neutral. The people who read the anti-racist texts, who were primed with the anti-racist texts, viewed a lot more racial discrimination of the worst kind when they were primed with those texts compared to the agricultural texts. So let me just reiterate, these scenarios were designed to have no bias whatsoever. And the people who read agriculture or anti-racist text read the same texts. And one group not only saw microaggressions, racism, all kinds of discrimination that didn't exist, that was not there, but they also became much, much more willing to engage in authoritarian measures and demand that the admissions officer take more DEI training. So it enhances something called the hostile attribution bias. In other words, anti-racist ideology, anti-racist theory increases racial bigotry because it primes people to see or to make the worst possible interpretation of a situation. And that's what we're doing to kindergartners and grade 1 because of this idea that if you treat everyone like they're individuals and should be treated equally, that's racist? What are we doing? If you're going to be experimenting on very young children, you should actually seek approval to do that from their parents. And if their parents don't want it and they don't have a choice, maybe you need to pull your children out of school. That might have to be an option if our educators are not going to be open and honest about what's going on. We have a double bind situation. How do we approach it? I don't have the answer to that. I just want to get you to start thinking about what's going on. Maybe one of the solutions is actually asking teachers to show you as a parent the lesson plans that they use. I don't know, they may or may not show it to you. I also want to reiterate that not all teachers engage in this. Whilst CRRP, culturally relevant pedagogy and equity approach education, is a requirement, that's delivered in many, many different ways across school boards. So don't just go into your teacher and get really upset and say, you're doing this. That's not necessarily the case. I'm just showing you some things that I've been sent. This is, in my opinion, one of the worst that I've seen because it's delivered to such young children using a very, very faulty ideology. But just be aware that not all educators are doing this to the same degree. Many don't approve of this whatsoever, and they're in a situation where they have to sort of deliver it. They don't know how. So let's just have a little bit of nuance in how we approach it. Anyway, so I'm going to stop it here. Just to end this video, I'm going to share a clip from training from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education about anti-racism, about race consciousness. This is somebody who teaches teachers. He educates the educators. So these are the people that are going to be newly qualified teachers. I'm going to leave you with Dr. ABC talking about race consciousness, and I hope to see you in the next one.
I want to leave you with that. And then this other visual I saw. This is the second one I fell in love with. This is my favorite one, and this is second one I fell in love with. And it talks about the difference between anti-racist and, oh, I am not racist. Because when you say you are not racist, then you're going to the colorblind, right? I don't see color. We want you to see color. So if there's anybody here out of the 81 persons that are in the room who are still using that phrase, I want you to stop using it as of tonight. We want you to see color. We understand where it's coming from. It's coming from a good place, that you think everybody's equal. Well, everybody's not equal. Everybody's not being treated equal. And you think that, well, everybody have a chance. Everybody do not have a chance. There are people tonight, right as we are speaking, right in our neighborhoods and in Toronto and in nearby areas, trying to figure out where they will sleep tonight. I'm not trying to figure that out. I have a beautiful bed. There are people here who are trying, in this world, who are thinking, where will I get my next meal? I am not one of those persons. I just had sushi for dinner. So I want you to understand, sometimes, especially when you walk in certain power and privilege, we kind of do not understand the world around us, and we say things that are actually ridiculous. So we want you to see color. I don't want you to erase me. I want you to tell your friend, I went to this meeting tonight online, and this drop-dead gorgeous black man was the speaker. I want you to see me. So when you do the color blindness, the avoidance, the silence, it doesn't help. What we want you to do is the awareness, the listening, the education, and the activism.